All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here and joining me here at We the Governed. This is our Tuesday evening live stream. And I know we've been doing this for several weeks in a row. And this is kind of an experiment for me just to see how well this works and see what your feedback is to this method of communication, see if this is a positive thing for most of you out there. I apologize for those of you who got on last week and we had a little bit of problem getting started. So this time I wanted to get set up right away pretty smoothly this time, I hope. We're actually I'm in the new studio area. It's not really quite set up yet, but we're testing this out, and I'm hopeful and optimistic that by next week it'll be kind of the new live stream format that they can run here. And I'm kind of a charity case, so I always appreciate it when I get to take advantage of just some nice facilities here and get a chance to actually do a little bit higher quality version of the live stream than what we've had in the past. And so I've got a number of questions that are already popping in right here. And thematically, I think when I proposed this live stream today, I was going to talk about what it's like to be an activist or activism, what that means. Just kind of thematically, I'm going to stick to that in between questions as we go along. However, there are a number of questions that are here, and we can kind of jump into some of these. The first question from Rock here was that, have you heard of communitarianism? And yes, I have, but I don't know that there's I'm not knowing it or having heard of it. I'm not sure that there's anything super relevant to a lot of the stuff I do to day that communitarianism would actually have much to do with. There's a question from Charlene here about, do you think the military will be walking our streets soon? Well, no, not really. I don't. I do think that there's a lot of people that tend to hype up. Listen, we have a lot of problems out there, and everybody knows we're living in a chaotic time. But I also know that people tend to, especially I think in the day of social media, there is a tendency to exaggerate some of the concerns of the theories. And I do think that there are people who basically spend their time trying to hype up threats that are coming from just around the corner, and having the military in the street right now is not what I would consider one of the biggest concerns that exists out there. You have a problem potentially in some of the cities, right, where you could have some law and order breakdown, where I can imagine them bringing in National Guard or something like that, but I don't see it being anything more extensive than that right now. Things can always change, but that's my prediction at this point in time. There's a question from Cristiano here about, isn't SB 5599 state-sponsored kidnapping? And my answer to that actually is that it is. And I'll explain why, because that bill was really bad. And it's not just because it's a bad bill. The legislature in Olympia and Washington State here did, of course, a whole bunch of terrible bills. That was just one of the more absurd ones that got a lot of national attention. Essentially, what it does is it allows a kid to basically run away from home, and they could be enticed to leave home. They can be put and who knows where they go, but they can leave and not be under the care of their parents. And they can say, my mom, or my dad or my parents won't let me cut off my genitals, and so therefore I'm running away. And so the state is allowed to take this kid in and then conceal. They don't even have to tell the parents that they have them, and they don't have to tell them where they are. So imagine if you're a parent and your child's run away and you have no idea for days at a time where they are, where they've gone. And the state is actually allowed to just conceal and hide from the parent where the child is. And that is the definition of kidnapping. That actually is the definition. And especially when you have no idea as a parent whether the child is actually there of their own free will. You don't know what's happened to them. It's a terrifying experience to imagine. You already have scenarios where kids are running away right now. Sometimes I never personally ran away from home, but I certainly had friends when I was younger who would run away for a couple hours and come back. I mean, kids do silly things. And when the state's going to involve itself in that, that's insane. And it's bizarre and it's inevitable. It's just ripe for all kinds of abuse. And because every state agency, given a little bit of power, tends to abuse the power they get and then take that power and go even further with no consequences, whether or not they follow the law. This is a big concern. Any parent that's out there should be concerned about this. Anybody that actually cares about children should care about it. It's just an ugly thing that they did, and it's bizarre, and especially removing parents from the ability to have some influence, especially over medical care that their kids have right now. This has been a sequence of really bad policy choices and decisions that our legislatures made. This is just the most recent in a series of really bad and dumb things that they've done. There's a Jason here saying, by the way, Jason, thank you for putting in at We the Government. It's easy for me to spot the question there. Appreciate you doing these. Could you do these more often? The question is, why is there bus stops suddenly being built everywhere? Are they trying to spend all the COVID funding money? Jason, I'm not sure where you're seeing the bus stops being built. I've seen some in Vancouver, Washington, and I've seen some in a couple other places. But I don't think there's a particularly unusual proliferation of bus stops being built right now, other than a couple of projects in a few of the bigger cities that I'm aware of right now. So I'm not sure that there's been bus stops being built everywhere. Whether they're wasting the money, COVID funding money, of course. I mean, that's the goal of government, is to waste all the money they get. And there may be some concerns that because in DC, the Republicans have discussed basically recapturing some of the unused COVID funds and feeding them back in to reduce the deficit or fund something else in government. Maybe there's a rush to the exit so that all the local governments, of course, the more they can grab and spend, the faster they can get it done. But I'm not sure that the bus stops have anything to do with that. Hawk fan for life, you're asking me, are you not monetized? I don't see a super chat option or memberships. No, I don't have that set up yet on my YouTube channel. That's true. I'm considering setting up some of those things. The live stream portion, this is a little bit new for us on this channel. I haven't done a lot of it. So that's why I don't have a super chat program set up. To some extent, a lot of this stuff I'm doing myself. I have some friends of mine that do help me not be entirely incompetent. And if it wasn't for them, I probably wouldn't be able to do the live streams or some of these other things I'm doing. But I just haven't set that up yet. You can actually support me on my website at We the Governed if you want to make donations. It's usually linked. It's through my website, We the Governed. And when this particular live stream is done, I usually put that link into the video description file down below, so you can go there if you'd like to. And on my YouTube channel, usually my videos have some level of advertising, not a lot. Believe me, it's not the path to riches there at all, but it does have some advertising, and unless they don't like one of my videos and then they demonetize that video. But that doesn't happen to me as often as you think it would be. Question from Charlene, are small cities being built? Actually, that's an interesting question. It's not some... you'll have places like near where I live. There's a place called Rochester. It's actually not a formal city. It's just an area. It's a designated geographic location, but it's not a formal city. And so it's been called Rochester for 100 years or so, but it's not specifically a city. And so technically it doesn't become a city until it incorporates. And so Washington State has historically had like these waves of cities that have been developed, especially since the Growth Management Act in 1990. And like there was a big wave when you saw the city of SeaTac and Newcastle, Covington, a wave of cities that all came about in the early 90s. My dad was involved in helping incorporate some of those cities in King County, and mostly those cities were trying to get away from King County. So typically you'll get several cities that will incorporate outside of main urban areas. And so it's not about building new cities as much as it's just the community usually gets together. Edgewood is a good example of this, where they'll get together and they'll decide, hey, we want to have our own community here because we don't like what the county's doing, or we want to hold off Seattle, or whatever the story is. And they get together and they create a new city. It's not an easy process. As I witnessed firsthand when my dad was involved in set up Newcastle, and he was on the city council there for a while. There's a lot that's involved in setting up a new city, and usually your goals and objectives of what you're trying to achieve by setting up that new city, you'll find that they tend to go astray once it's been incorporated for a while. It's very difficult to hold off the bureaucrats if that was your goal. Question here from Jason: what is Sideshow Bob's theme song? Mine for him is Too Sexy for My Shirt. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't thought of theme songs for Bob Ferguson. It would probably be the theme song to a horror movie of some kind. I've called him the Freddy Krueger of Washington state politics, but I don't know what his theme song would be. It's a good question. I'll try to come up with one. You're making me think of a couple of approaches. That's a pretty good idea for any future video. Um, and Hawk fan, you're mentioning not even genitals. Yeah, implants or injections. Yes, there's many other things. Sorry, what you're referencing there is actually under SB 5599, the ability of the state to do a bunch of things to your kid, to your child, if they run away and they get a hold of them and they give them to one of these nonprofit groups, whatever that nonprofit group does. And there's a ton of medical procedures against that for them that they could do that are life altering and permanent. And then suddenly you'll when you finally discover your kid, you'll find out all these terrible things were done to them, which they may or may not regret later. Probably they would regret it. And as a parent, it's devastating. As a child, it's devastating. It's a complete disaster. Um, Todd, you mentioned something about your kids never going back to school as long as the law exists. Yeah, well, I mean, it isn't just the schools, right? Remember, they don't have to be in school to run away. Going to private school doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And frankly, it's if somebody is able to convince them or entice them away, the state's allowed to do something like this. It's really a terrible idea. I think that restoring parents' rights in the state is an incredibly important step to restoring a regular level of citizen control. In many ways, I feel like 5599 is like sometimes you can't tell when the jump the shark moment occurs, especially when there's so many of them happening all at the same time. But I feel like this is one of those times. So let's see. So I'm looking more for questions than I am for comments. There's a comment here made by Jason, why does Olympia hate Washington State farmers? Look forward to meeting you at Skagit Lincoln Day dinner. Yes, I'm going to be up in Skagit County at the Lincoln Day dinner on June 10th, if I remember correctly. And unfortunately, for those of you who live in Skagit County and San Juan County, they both invited me there, but I'd already committed to Skagit, so I couldn't go to San Juan County, which I love going up there. They had the Lincoln Day dinner at the same exact time in their neighboring counties. But so next time, coordinate that a little bit better, hopefully. But I will be in Skagit County. And then the question related to that is that Olympia, why do they hate farmers? So I'm on this board of the State Farm Bureau, and I've been involved in the Farm Bureau for a long time. We live rurally. Our family's multiple generations of farmers, although we're much different type of operation now than we were generations ago. But the thing about farming is everybody says they love farmers. They do. If you go to a big group of leftists and they'll tell you they love farmers. But what happens is farming is something that I think, especially in the environmental side of things, that they've come up with all kinds of regulatory restrictions on farming. And so what happens is it becomes a great opportunity for a bunch of grant grifting operations to exist and pretend like they're around farming. They won't tell you they hate farming. They'll tell you they love farming, but what they really want are unrealistic types of applications to farming. And then they're always aggressive and hostile towards people who live rurally, which is where shockingly for most leftists, that's where your food actually comes from, is from people who live rurally. And so you can go and plant vegetables in your backyard like we do, and you can have a small orchard like we do, and you can can food like we do, and you can raise something, get a lot of your own food, but that's probably not a realistic way for most people to fund or to feed themselves. So they're inevitably going to have to get food from somewhere else. It's very hard to completely grow everything that you want. And so you're going to have to go get food from somewhere. And there seems to be just this complete disconnect with the policies that you'll get out of Department of Ecology, even the Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce sometimes, and certainly anything that's related to the environmental side of things that is helpful to agriculture. And you particularly see this with some of the stuff they've done more overseas even than they've done here, where In the Netherlands, where they're trying to shut down the majority of the farming over claiming some of it has to do with CO2, some of it has to do with nitrogen. There's all kinds of excuses that are used: buffer zones on rivers, salmon habitat restoration, pocket gophers. There's all kinds of excuses that can be used to basically restrict and shut down farming. And especially farming in America, you only have about 1.5% of the population that's at all remotely familiar with the farming that are involved in actually feeding people. So because of that, the ignorance of the general population, in particular the bureaucrats, as to what actually goes into farming or what's involved in actually running a real farm operation, um, allows them to come up with absurd and stupid ideas all the time that they think is perfectly logical and appropriate, and they impose it on you, and that inevitably restricts the ability of people to actually live as farmers. We used to say that the way the bureaucrats look at farming is they love the idea of farming, they just hate the farmers that are out there. So they have no problem putting every farmer out of business, and they don't think it really affects them. And it's just one of these terrible, disastrous situations that we run into, and it's a slow motion train wreck because they start to erode at the farming independence. And eventually, as you eliminate farms, the handful of farms that are left tend to get really big because that's a way you can deal with bureaucrats. The rules that the bureaucracy tends to impose on farming don't affect the big farming operations. Big farming operations are able to operate. They just hire people to deal with the bureaucrats, and they have attorneys, and they're big. It's the little guys and the medium-sized people who are destroyed by the regulatory state. And the Department of Ecology, they don't care. They think it's great. They're happy to destroy it. You saw the same thing with logging when they imposed some of the farm forestry rules years ago, and they were happy to put all the small logging operations, mom and pop operations, out of business, and then just deal with really big conglomerates because that's easier for bureaucrats anyway. So it's just I really went off on a tangent there about farming, but here's a question from Jason. Again, Jason, thank you for saying "We the govern." It's easier to spot that question. What's your thoughts on Ron DeSantis running for president? I honestly think he needs to stay as governor. Well, apparently Ron DeSantis is going to announce tomorrow, and we'll see what happens. I mean, I think he's been a great governor of Florida. I think it's a good example of somebody who got elected by a very thin, slim margin, and governed actually fairly aggressively in Florida, probably one of the more aggressive governors, at least since Scott Walker in Wisconsin. I mean, definitely willing to be aggressive and do what he said he was going to do. It really seems like he's implementing that in Florida. And so the logical thing is usually taking, it's not unusual when you have a presidential race coming up, you're going to be drawing from governors and senators, federal senators, with more success usually leaning towards the governor potential candidates. So it doesn't surprise me that Ron DeSantis is jumping in. I have no idea how to predict where things are going to go in the presidential election. Frankly, there's a lot of other people who probably know more about it than I do, and they're jumping in and they're giving you their 2 cents. I don't know what's going to happen. You have some good people jumping in. Just because people are running against each other doesn't make that one person good and everyone else evil. I don't know why people tend to take that approach in the primary, especially. We have some good people that are all jumping in. Who's going to come out of it? I don't know. There's a lot to do between now and then. Good people sometimes just, it turns out they can't run a good campaign, or they hire one of the many just horrible and terrible consultants that DC seems to produce as fast as possible, who their incompetence ensures the end of that campaign. I don't know who he hired, but we'll see. But that seems to be a common issue there. Let's see. Raggedy Ann, how do you feel about emancipation for minors in Washington? Well, keep in mind, the emancipation process for minors in Washington has actually existed for a long time. A formal process where somebody goes through emancipation from their parents shouldn't be something that's really easy to do, but it can exist for those edge cases where you have exceptionally abusive parents in prison, just really difficult sorts of scenarios. What's weird is that the law changes that Washington's had recently have basically started to trend not towards emancipation in the legal term, but really towards making it so that parents just have a hard time parenting. As any parent who has a child over 13 knows, the ability to actually help your child with healthcare issues, which you're responsible for, at least until they're 18, maybe 27, depending on how they look at it, but 18 at least, you need to know, what's going on with your child. And for the hospitals now to keep it secret for everything that happens when your child goes in for a medical exam after the 13, it makes it really hard. And even when there's a whole waiver form system you can go through, even when they do all that right and you agree with it, even then the hospital makes it hard for you to be able to help. So if you have a good relationship with your child, it just becomes a bureaucratic obstacle and a way to make the process more obnoxious. If you don't have a good relationship with your child, or there's a little bit of a fight going on or something like that, you have no idea what's going on with them. And I think that this is likely to lead towards medical complications and problems, because parents are going to know their child pretty well. And if most parents are, and if you're not going to allow them to have to be able to monitor, make sure that, especially kids that have a lot of medical challenges, if the parents can't help or be aware of what's going on, why in God's name do you think that a bureaucrat at a hospital that has 1,000 patients, right, or they're dealing with tons of them, how do you think they're going to have a better way of staying on top of that medication? I can't tell you how many parents have actually caught mistakes that were made by pharmacies or medical providers of some kind, that if they just not paid any attention and just taken the drugs they were given or the advice they were given at the time, something terrible would have happened to their child, or could have happened. And instead they were aware of it and they paid attention and they prevented tragedy or something bad from happening. And the state has decided to not go down that road again. Tony is asking a question. Do you think Trump can win again? Sure, he can. I mean, anybody can win at this point in time. We're too far out really to know the landscape for sure on the presidential race. That's why I don't spend any time. I'm not going to waste my time talking about it. Too far away. We'll have to see how it goes. Hawk fan, you're asking about what's the Lincoln dinner. The Lincoln Day dinner is usually the term used by most Republican counties, Republican Party chapters in the state for their annual fundraising event. It's going back to the founding of the Republican Party, and Lincoln obviously being the first Republican president. And he's been especially if you're in a northern state. I found out the Republican parties in some of the southern states don't have Lincoln Day dinners. They don't in Georgia, for example. But if you're a northern state like Washington and you've been a Republican state or the Republicans up here, of course, have been Northern Republicans for a long time, they have Lincoln Day dinners. That's what they call them. I am frequently brought out to speak at Lincoln Day dinners. Sometimes I MC at some. I've been busy this year. I'm seeing a lot of them lately and speaking at some of them. And so I'm using that as shorthand to just describe what's going on in Skagit County. I think I'm doing a fundraiser in Kitsap County speaking. I think I'm a co-MC there coming up. I just MC'd at the Pierce County Lincoln Day dinner just recently. Steve, yep, you're asking, what do you think looks like a conservative activist? Well, a conservative activist is, in my opinion, defined by what you do and partly what you believe. I would hope that a conservative activist believes in liberty and freedom, and therefore the actions you take are trying to promote and push liberty and freedom forward. Typically what that means, if you're an activist, is that you're in probably more of an adversarial relationship with the administrative state or big government in one form or another, particularly when you're in a state like Washington that abuses the citizens using the administrative state. But frankly, if you're in Idaho or Texas or any of these other places, you're going to pretty much have the same type of issues. It might be colored slightly different. You might be having a little different fight. You might be fighting people with an R next to their name in those states. But that's what you're fighting for. And so you're fighting to promote the freedom and liberty agenda. Usually that means if you're going to play offense and not defense, you're going to try to come up with ways of shrinking the abusiveness of the size of the state government or the local government, your planning department, whatever it is, whichever area but government's becoming most bloated where you live and starting to abuse you. At the same time, you're probably going to do things like defend freedom and liberty, free speech, transparency of government. You're going to defend Second Amendment rights. You're going to individual rights in general, you're going to protect and you're going to defend it and you're going to make sure that they're protected. And I think that's what the definition of a conservative activist would be. What you do day to day, I'm happy to talk about that here. Let me get through a couple more questions and I might just switch back to that topic. How do we convert couch potatoes into activists in light of the legislation passed by the legislature? Good question, Steve. That's actually a good question there. The enemy of freedom tends to be apathy and fear. And apathy just means that you typically, it's what I used to say in college when I was an activist, that apathy is the enemy of freedom. But I modify that. I say apathy and fear. Apathy is that you just don't care, you don't think it matters, and so you're not involved in politics, or you think it's pointless, so you just aren't involved. Typically, the apathetic person wakes up when they realize that the rules and regulations, the crazy people in charge, whatever, it actually affects their life. And they suddenly have an awakening moment where they're no longer apathetic because it's directly affecting who they are and what they're trying to do. Maybe it's they can't build a porch in their house. Maybe their kid can't build a home. Maybe they find out that the permit to do something minor on their property is $30,000, whatever it is. That's what wakes them up. You can't force somebody to not be apathetic, but you can do a good job educating them. And when they discover it actually directly affects them, that's usually how they come off the couch. The question with fear is a little different issue. And I've seen that more lately than I used to. And this has to do more with, in modern times now, it's more like cancel culture or personal threats against people who dare to stand up and confront the big government. And that's a little bit of a different animal. You have to convince people that not to be intimidated, because frankly, I think that the left, when they use these fear or violence sort of tactics against people, and it's usually a threat of violence, they're using them because they work in most cases. People run away, they hide, they're afraid. And so they threaten them. And if you're willing to resist that and push back and not be intimidated by it, I think that you reduce the amount of, say, threats that are typically thrown out there. And all you see with this modern cancel culture is just kind of an extension of that process. Let's see. I'm looking for a question here, guys. Do you think codes, regulation, and permits are constitutional? This is a question from Rock. Gosh, no, I don't. But you also have a structural reality that you're dealing with here that goes back to, I think, mistaken constitutional decisions that have been made by the Supreme Court in particular, historic Supreme Court, not the current one. We're actually looking at, there's actually some Supreme Court cases right now that could reverse things a lot. And what we're really talking about, what I'm talking about when you ask that question is, do you as a organized group of citizens say that you have the ability to get together and decide rules of the road, right, where you live? And the answer to that is yes, you do. In a representative type of government, right, in a republic in which you're deciding the rules under which you live, yes, you can impose certain rules. You can decide that for a traffic ticket, if somebody's speeding 80 miles an hour in a 25-mile-an-hour zone, there's a penalty for that. You can determine what that is. And so that you're allowed to put together roads that you need to stop at a stop sign, whatever. I mean, this is the simple and the lazy things to talk about. Do I think that the abuse of the regulatory state is even remotely appropriate in most cases? And the answer is no. Just look to the Department of Ecology, the central planning schemes that have come out of like the Growth Management Act, using that to justify the abuse of the planning department process where people live. Where a home to build a house, just one home on a 5-acre piece of land, you can get $40,000, $50,000 of permitting costs for nothing. Those permit fees just go and get squandered and flushed away with the rest of your tax dollars for no reason, providing zero value to the person who's trying to build that home. Those are the kind of things that we have gotten entirely out of control on. And in Washington State, you have what's called the RCWs, which is the Revised Code of Washington. That's what the legislature passes. When they pass a law, it becomes code. Your elected officials have passed that law. They voted for it. Elected officials don't like going into the nitty-gritty details sometimes. And so what they do is they outsource the actual administrative aspect of whatever those laws are that they pass. And so agencies create what's called the WAC, which is the Washington Administrative Code in our state. Every state has something similar to this. Idaho has it, Nebraska, Texas, every state, Florida, they all have it. That is where most of the abuse is really done when it comes to what I think are unconstitutional sort of activities by the bureaucracy to abuse your individual freedom. It usually occurs in that area. There's several reforms that are relatively straightforward. In fact, I helped draft a couple of bill ideas a number of years ago with CAPER, Citizens Alliance for Property Rights, and we submitted them, and we had legislators who were willing to put them in. Of course, the Democrats didn't want to allow them through, but they're drafted out there and they're really good reforms. And that is that it makes, for instance, all the legislators, it makes the legislators have to vote on every whack change that is proposed individually by line item every time, which they're not going to like. And that's a good way to start to rein in. There's a number of different ways to start reining this in. But gosh, there's so many things that need to be fixed on that. It's a lot of work. One of the ways, of course, if you care about freedom and liberty, you just have to downsize government. There's no other choice. That's probably a mandatory thing. And you have to basically eliminate a lot of the grant grifting operations that go on now, because these NGOs, nonprofits, sometimes they're for-profit entities that exist outside, really function as kind of a shadow government policy implementer crew. Homeless industrial complex, you see it all the time, environmental issues especially. And these groups exist theoretically to help solve some kind of problem the government wants to solve. But in reality, when you study them, you'll find that they don't want to solve any of the problems that they've supposedly claimed they're going to solve. They actually exist to perpetuate the problem, because that's the only way you continue to get your grants. It's the only way you get your grant to grow next year. And there's a lot of problems with that. Let's see. Question. Can you do an update on the Department of Ecology and that trash pit they had on their campus? Great. This is a question from Jason. For those of you who don't know, a couple years ago, it was right towards the end of COVID, I went up and videotaped and documented a massive trash. It was a homeless druggie camp that was growing on the campus of the Department of Ecology, right outside their front door. When you drove up to their offices, it was actually in the green space right in front of them. And keep in mind, everybody that worked at the Department of Ecology could look out their window and see this. And when I say trash pile, I'm talking there's a salmon stream that's actually in the campus. It comes down from St. Martin's University through the Department of Ecology. And right there, they had literally filled the salmon stream with garbage by just dozens of feet, just piled up with garbage. They had an open pit latrine. They were burning garbage there, openly burning garbage right next to the Department of Ecology, within just like 150 feet, about 100 yards from the front door, I would say, is where it was. But it spread out into their parking lot. Open pit latrine right there. They could moon. Apparently, these homeless guys were mooning the Department of Ecology employees. They had a chop shop there where they were stealing people's lawnmowers and small cars, and they were dumping oil and battery acid right into the stream. And this was growing for about a year and a half. And keep in mind, the Department of Ecology building, that's kind of in Lacey right there. Every employee who worked there had to drive by this place every day on the way in. And not just them, everybody who worked at the EPA, because the EPA leases a couple offices downstairs, they had to drive by. And everybody who works for the State Conservation Board, they drove by. And everybody who works for U.S. Fish and Wildlife, which is in the building behind them, in the Marine Fisheries Department, Federal Marine Fisheries Department, they all had to drive by. Not a single employee who worked at any of those agencies thought that it would be worth stepping out of your car and picking up one scrap of garbage. They never did it. They were happy to just let it proliferate and grow like the blob, dumping garbage everywhere. In fact, it was so bad that when the director of ecology was going to do her Earth Day video out front, which they normally did with this green space behind them, they had to change the angle of their net video that year, which is, I think, 2021 is what I remember. Might have been 2022 now, but they had to change the angle of that camera for the Earth Day video, because if they did where they would normally do it, there'd be all this garbage behind them, and they didn't want to have the smoke, the burning garbage and the open pit latrine and the junk pile there in the video. They're just such hypocrites. So when I went out and documented it all, they said I was an illegal journalist, trespassing on their properties. Of course, it's not private property; the state owns it, but it did motivate them to clean it up. They did clean up most of it. There is still some garbage there. I was thinking about going back and doing a story about the unlicensed landfill that they essentially still have in the Department of Ecology property. Keep in mind, it's more than just this, right? It's the fact that at the same time that this is going on in the Department of Ecology campus, they are imposing absurd and ridiculous fines and abusive attacks on farmers or other people all around the state, and claiming that they had the potential to pollute, when the reality is there was far more pollution on the Department of Ecology's front campus than there was in any of these farming operations that they were supposedly going after. So it was significant hypocrisy, and it was really absurd. And anyway, it was one of those things. It's still, I don't know why the Department of Ecology doesn't like me, but it's just ridiculous. It's not as dirty as it was before, though. I drove by it just recently to see if it was refilling up with garbage, and when I last checked, it was not. Jason, you have a question here. When will the Washington taxpayer run out of money? Good question. Don't know. We certainly have no shortage of funds in the state budget. I don't have the state budget in front of me right now, but it has gone up substantially since I've been involved in politics over the last 12 years. It is way bigger now than it has been before. And we probably get a lot less services for a lot more money than we ever did before. Let's see. This is TZ. You're asking a question. Do you know how many cities in the Seattle area have any Republicans on city councils? And I want to live in a sane city. The challenge is always that cities are a difficult place to live in. There have been some good people, sometimes a majority, sometimes not, in the city of SeaTac, in the city of Federal Way, in the city of Newcastle, off and on. You've seen that in Auburn. You've seen it out the more rural cities like Maple Valley, Enumclaw, some of these other places out there. They oftentimes have fairly conservative cities. That's more eastern King County. Issaquah doesn't right now. Neither does, I don't believe, Redmond. Kirkland has one, I think, still on their council there. And Edmonds has had kind of a shift. There's been some more sane people. The question about Republican is a different question. I usually consider somebody good if they believe that math is real. They're not crazy into the woke agenda. They care about budget and fiscal responsibility, and they're not trying to take away freedoms and rights every time they show up at a city council meeting. That doesn't necessarily make them Republican. It probably does in most cases, but it certainly makes them people that are okay to have in government. The lefties that tend to get involved in these are no good at all. There have been some good people that have been elected to the Renton City Council lately. Burien has had some in the past. There's been a big fight in Burien, big fight in SeaTac. This has kind of changed a bit over the years, and it kind of comes and goes in waves, right? Back and forth in some of these cities. But it takes effort. And what I've found is that conservatives will spend, just like a lot of questions here, they're talking about what's going on in DC. They'll spend a lot of time obsessing about DC, even though we're 3,000 miles away and have very little impact on what happens there. And they won't spend a minute of their life dealing with the issue in the city where they live or the county where they live, which has a much more practical impact on their day-to-day living. Whether you have bad crime, whether you have good roads, whether you have bridges going to fall down, whether you're going to have garbage in your ditches, whether you're going to have ridiculous taxes. It's local government that does that. And I think we have to pay more attention to that. I'm sorry, I'm losing a bunch of questions here. Breaking, do you have any thoughts on the We See You press release today? I haven't seen it. So no, I don't have any thoughts on that. Mike, you're asking a question, what agencies of our bloated government would you cut? Well, great. I mean, there's a lot of places you could cut. Some things you would probably just chop down a lot. A Puget Sound Partnership, for example, that's a stupid agency that it was just a nepotistic kickback scheme that was created for Norm Dick's son, who turned out to be so incompetent he actually couldn't run it. But then, of course, you hire bureaucrats. They're based out of Tacoma. They essentially do a lot of the Department of Ecology jobs. It's very similar type work. They exist to perpetuate themselves. If they disappeared tomorrow, nobody'd miss them. There's literally not a single bit of value you get out of that. It's an agency that if it disappeared tomorrow, again, nobody would care. Nobody would notice. The grifting operations that they support with their kickback schemes of grant stuff would go away. That's an example of one you can just eliminate. The Evergreen State College is a good example of something that should just be put out of its misery. You've had 3 rounds of staff layoffs. You've had a 50% reduction in student enrollment. You've had a massive pushback of employers that refuse to hire anybody with an Evergreen State College degree. It has a massive transfer rate of students who come in as freshmen and transfer out as quick as possible. There's no standards there. You don't even have to be a real human and they'll accept you as long as you're willing to pay somehow the money back. It's just a fiasco. It's a disaster. It's an embarrassment to the concept of education. There's really no reason to have it. If that whole thing went away tomorrow, nobody would miss it either. Again, it's used as a jobs program for former state senators and other people so that they can just go in there and collect 6-figure salaries as kind of their payback for whatever giveaways they gave while they were in the legislature. So I don't, those are just some examples. Even if you look at Department of Ecology, there's elements of the Department of Ecology you probably want to keep, and there's others that you don't. For instance, I actually think that there's a subdivision there, because I've gone through a lot of their emails in the years in past, that deals with like nuclear cleanup and radioactive cleanup and stuff. They actually have some real scientists that work there. they're kind of buried down in the bowels of the agency. But there's probably some value in keeping the people who are really familiar and knowledgeable with that, at least making the testing of that process. Like there's also what they call the Olympia air quality, ORCA. You might have heard of that before. Like all of those entities should just be eliminated and all put under the Department of Ecology. And instead of having enforcement mechanisms, they should just simply be monitoring air quality and water quality stations. That's really what I would shift the Department of Ecology into. So you could probably fire about 1,000 people that work there, give or take, and nobody would notice. The world would be a better place, and we wouldn't need them involved in basically trying to micromanage the comp plans or shoreline setbacks of every jurisdiction in Washington State. They really do a lot of bad things. There's two departments in the Department of Ecology that should be shifted to Department of Natural Resources. One is Ecology actually manages dams in Washington State, and it's never made any sense to me if they locate it there. They should locate that in Department of Natural Resources. The other one is water, wells and water rights. Monitoring water quality is fine. If you got to have a repository for some of that information somewhere, there's some value in that, but I don't think it makes sense. Water's a natural resource. The Department of Natural Resources should have it. You can fire everybody in the Department of Ecology's shoreline division. That group's crazy, and they don't provide any value either. But anyway, so there's a lot of stuff like that that you'd have to go through a lot. There's a lot. That's just a start. There's a bunch more. There's a lot of bloat and waste in state government, even in local government. You can find it if you look. TZ question, Glenn, is Washington State pushing the 15-minute cities? I don't want any part of them, question mark. Well, I'm assuming that that's not a question. You don't want any part of them. You're going to have some people that are pushing 15-minute cities. It's a terrible idea. It's kind of like the old Ecology concept or the any of those bad ideas that come out. There's nothing good about that, and it's totally unrealistic in most cases. Steve, question, are there resources available to help people deal with the fear of activism? Is there a support group for timid wannabe activists? I don't know if there's really a specific support group. I don't think there is, but your best bet is, I always think that there's strength in numbers a little bit, not that you have to have a really big group. I think if a group gets too big, more than 20 people becomes unwieldy, and you'll have activism attracts some of the most amazing people that you'll ever meet, but it also attracts people who bring drama with them, and they only want to be dramatic for whatever their own personal reasons are. And so you have to, I think it's best, activist groups are best if they're relatively small. And then you coordinate with other people, right? Get to know what other people are doing, and you kind of share best practices. I don't think that there's anything specifically set up. I'm happy to train activists. I do a lot of that during the year. It's one of the things I do is go out and help people learn how to file PDC complaints, how to do records requests, how to approach bureaucracy and try to figure out how it works and who's working there, doing background checks on them, all kinds of stuff. Happy to help. And if you have something you're thinking about doing, contact me and I'll try to help you too. Do you know about the 2-book accounting system used by all incorporated municipalities and the CAFR? This is from Rock. I'm pretty familiar with CAFR. Well, I've gone down this rabbit hole a few times in the past. Listen, if anybody just bothers to look at government and how they're spending money, you're going to find lots of problems. It's actually a pretty big deal. Heidi, you mentioned something about Bellevue. Yeah, Bellevue, I would say, is an example of a city that probably likes the sound of a 15-minute city, although that's not been the approach they've typically taken there. Some of the elected officials have pushed back on that. Let's see. CT, you're asking, I need to be able to sue legislators and politicians. How can we change the laws so that we can sue the politicians? I mean, you can sue them. Politicians get sued all the time. It doesn't mean you're going to prevail, and you can't just sue them for the heck of it, and you can't just make something up. There's a fairly high bar, and so I don't know why you're it's not that I couldn't come up with reasons as to why you'd want to sue them. If you know anything about litigation, you're going to have a good cause, and you're going to have some evidence, and you have to put something together. You can sue people because you don't like them, but I don't think you're going to have a lot of success down that road unless you're a leftist. Let's see. Going for questions. Can we sue the Department of Ecology? Is a question from TZ. Sure you can, but you're going to have to be, when you have that type of litigation, mostly you have to show that it hurt you specifically. Very hard. It takes a lot of money, some serious attorneys, of which there's only a few in the state, capable of processing that, but it's possible. Let's see. Heidi's saying, do you believe we're actually experiencing a housing crisis that necessitated that necessitated the suite of overreaching middle housing bills. What about a tax on investor properties, especially Airbnb? Um, the housing crisis, depending on how we want to define it, it isn't what you see on the streets of Seattle. What you see on the streets of Seattle is a lot of drug addicts who, well, no matter what you did, wouldn't have housing because they would squander whatever they had in order to feed their addiction. And you have a drug addiction crisis there. You don't have a housing crisis. There is a housing crisis in the sense that the central planning schemes and the rules and regulations that surround that have artificially inflated and the cost of housing. And then even worse, the regulatory burden, particularly in cities, Bellevue, Spokane, some of these other cities, I'm sorry, not so much Bellevue, Seattle and Spokane, I should say, Olympia, they've created policies that are hostile to small rentals, basically attacking landlords, make it hard to rent, which inevitably, because those rules happen, if you're going to be risky, live dangerously, and be a landlord, that ultimately increases the cost. And so all these things artificially inflate the cost of cities or of housing. So inevitably, you're going to have a housing crisis that as far as people can't afford homes, because you're implementing policies that artificially inflate the costs by adding ridiculous permitting fees, ridiculous regulatory restrictions, and it's not producing a higher quality home. I could actually see it a little bit if you're producing a higher quality home, but it isn't. It doesn't produce a higher quality home at all. And so because of that, you really introduce this disaster zone of a bloated bureaucracy and planning department that basically feeds like a parasite on the potential that people are going to try to do stuff on their properties. And they basically suck all the money they can into their own operations. And that creates a housing crisis in the sense that the price of housing is so much higher. That is 100% artificial, created by the bureaucracy. Let's see, how much are taxpayers paying for the I'm assuming the new fee bus service in Thurston and King County? Curious as to why Pierce County Orca is not free, unless that changed. This is from Meg. I don't actually know. That's a good question. I haven't looked at that lately, and we don't have a good deal, right? Our public transportation, such as it is mostly a disaster. However, most of these bus services, at least when I've looked into them, they generally have free bus services in some of the metro areas, and then you're only charging when you're heading outside of those metro areas. So if they've changed that policy lately, it's probably because of the financial challenges that they've been in lately, and it's been a disaster. All of them lose money. None of them are going to make any money. None of them are ever going to even break even. And so it's just a sinkhole of money. It may very well be that a community can decide that you can do something as a public service because you want that in your community. Good example of this actually are pools. Pools don't make money. Pools lose money. They always do, but the community kind of likes a pool. And so they'll put a pool in, and even if they can run it without losing, but really the goal is to run a pool without losing too much money, because every 20, 30 years, you have to do a big cost investment in that pool to update it or fix it. So community can go ahead and decide, we're going to have a community good here and it's going to cost us money, but we're willing to do it. Busing is oftentimes, or not just busing, but public transportation is usually sold as not just a community good, but as, hey, we can break even, or it doesn't have to be subsidized forever, but they always have to be subsidized. And they particularly have to be subsidized the way our state has chosen to run most of them. The descending order of disaster, right? The worst thing you can do is build light rail. That's the most inefficient, archaic, useless sort of investment that you can make in public transportation. The next one down is then you get to buses. Buses, though, still kind of make sense in the sense that at least you can be flexible with them, right? You still use the same infrastructure that you have for congestion relief for cars. So it's still better. Rapid transit at least has the ability to lose less money and at least gets to provide value at times than you're going to get from any kind of a light rail system. Light rail is the worst. And anyway, there's all nuances in there because there's van services and carpools and other things, but there's ways of doing it better. There's somebody here who basically said that I've talked to a couple of Renton City Council members and the mayor, and they seem nice. Yes, they do. Nice people don't always do good things, but there are some. Renton actually has the potential to improve right now, and I'm kind of happy about that. TZ saying that a Washington State Republican is not the same as an Oklahoma Republican. True. Oklahoma Republicans are lazy and have no idea what they have. And the reason why Oklahoma will lose their freedom is because the Republicans that they have in charge there will be clueless and pass stupid bills and laws and rules because they have no idea what they really mean. It's just like Idaho passed their the equivalent of the consumer or of the Growth Management Act. Like, why did Idaho do that? That's Republicans that did that, and they don't need to do stuff like that. But again, they fall for every scam that comes to them because they're lazy and they think, well, an R next to your name means that you're okay, and that's not true. Cristiano was asking a question: do you have any idea of the number of men incarcerated in women's facilities because they identify as a woman? Big scandal. And before Dory Monson, the Seattle talk show host, passed away, I had this conversation with him after I did a show. I did a little segment on a show, and we got onto this topic because he's actually, for quite a while before he died, he was really focused on this topic a lot. And there's a number. I don't think that there's quite a few. I don't know if there's more than a dozen or 2 dozen, somewhere in that range. And there's more all the time. And the Department of Corrections is actively trying to conceal and hide the truth on this subject. This is actually quite a scandal. And it's going on right now. And it's not a left or right thing. This is straight up just human rights. It's just a terrible situation. And there's no reason ever that they should be putting a man, regardless of how they think they identify, whatever that means, in a women's facility. That's just absurd and ridiculous. And there's a lot of, there's going to be a big scandal, I think, that comes out on that. It's just amazing that people actually think that that's a legitimate policy. Are there some legit candidates for governor and attorney general? This is a question from Michael. Right now, there's no Republicans who I'm aware of that have announced and certainly not filed to run for attorney general next year. Remember, those races are all in 2024. People are filing early now, but we wouldn't technically even know about them for sure for a year. The only reason you know they filed is if they filed the Public Disclosure Commission and they're serious and they're running a campaign and they're raising money. So there's no Republicans that I'm aware of right now that have filed for attorney general. This would be too early for most Republicans. I haven't found Republicans think ahead very well or even plan ahead. And so whatever candidates are going to run, they probably are waiting for some reason to decide. There are 2 Republican candidates right now who have announced and filed and likely to raise. They both raise money. One is Semi Bird, who's on the Richland City School Board. Good guy, military background. I like his background. He's raised about $60,000 or so in the PDC. It's a tangible metric that I can measure. The other one is Raul Garcia, kind of from a similar area, both of them from Eastern Washington. Raul Garcia is from Cuba originally, escaped Cuba. He's a doctor. He did try kind of short term. He ran for governor 3 years ago during the governor's race at that time, and he raised about $400,000. So he has a lot of deep pockets that are behind him. I'm sure he'll probably run a real campaign. To my knowledge, right now, those are the only 2 Republicans that have filed so far. If I'm wrong, correct me, but those are the only 2 that I've seen who are raising money. If you haven't raised money, you're not serious, and you're not a serious campaign at all. So that's all I'm aware of right now. With Ferguson, here's a question from Milo. With Ferguson and Franz filing for governor, do you think Dr. Raul Garcia as a GOP candidate may have a chance? Well, with both of them filing, that doesn't make any difference. The chance for Raul Garcia, just like Semi Bird or any other Republican that jumps in that race that's serious, they have to campaign. They have to make the difference. Just because Ferguson and Franz are duking it out with each other and stabbing each other in the back, it doesn't make too much difference for the Republican, other than it's unlikely that there's votes going to either Franz or Ferguson. So if you have one dominant Republican candidate that kind of rises to the top out of the scrum and becomes the obvious one, what'll happen is Franz or Ferguson will lose one of them. And then whoever comes out of that 2 faces off against a Republican, because you still are going to have enough Republican votes that if they're focused, over half of the Republican votes, if it goes to one of these guys, that Republican's likely to pass through. Let's see. Let me get some questions. A lot of comments, guys, but those are not questions. So, any thoughts on the Blake fix? This is a good question, Jared. Well, the state did a nominal Blake fix. And for those who don't know what that is, that's having to do with the drug criminalization of drug possession, hard drugs. And so the problem was the Supreme Court decision called the Blake decision basically made it a lot harder to enforce drug possession laws, most of which were used not to put people in prison for life, but to get them off the streets and get them off of drugs in the first place. And when they being the Supreme Court, essentially decriminalized it, it's opened up all kinds of chaos. It's one of the reasons why you see a lot more drug addicts out on the streets. Not the only reason, but it's one of them. And so the Democrats were so incompetent that they said they wanted to fix it in this last legislative session, but they had such a terrible approach to it that they incompetently fumbled their own piece of legislation and couldn't get it done before leg session finished. And so there was so much blowback on the governor and the Democrats that they decided to have a special session just for a few days last week, and they fixed it. Now, what that fix really looks like in practice, I don't know, because it's not like they went back to making it a felony. They're kind of making it this little hybrid sort of lower level impact, but at least it's something that local law enforcement tells me they can use as a tool to help get people off drugs. We'll see. I think we have to look at it for about a year before we really know if there's any impact at all with it. And probably my sense is that we'll have to make more changes on that in the future. Heidi, no level of government will address the issue that investors are having on the housing market, foreign REITs, et cetera. They drive up price and land value. What recourse do we have? Well, here's my assessment on that. And I think foreign purchases of land is a different question. And I don't know how much of that's actually done in Washington State. There's a huge problem with that up in British Columbia. But it was kind of a very specific issue that was driving it, mainly with Hong Kong immigrants trying to get dual citizenship before and kind of after 97 when Hong Kong reverted over to China. So it drove like this huge artificially bloated housing issue up there more than anything else, more than you saw down in the US, because of how you could get a Canadian citizenship with a certain amount of investment at the time. On the US side, I don't think that's what drives the housing market as much. Some of it, like BlackRock or others, may be buying large volumes of homes that could artificially inflate it. But one of the issues you have right now is that if you restrict the land area that you can build homes on, you're going to make the land the most expensive part of building a home rather than the actual cost of building the home. And that has everything to do with the Growth Management Act and related pieces of legislation. So there's a little bit more, it's a little more complicated than this, but these housing bubbles have kind of happened before. And I think we're in a big one right now. And obviously interest rates going up are going to reduce the affordability of the houses even further. And so that's probably going to have a depressing effect on the actual value of homes moving forward. I haven't seen that as much as you'd think yet, but I suspect we're going to see it more in the future. Fix. Let's see. Question, what's your thoughts on Washington banning single-family housing? Is that why I'm seeing all these apartments being built? Jason, this is a question from Jason. Well, you're really talking about zoning laws. These zoning laws pop up and they basically eliminate single-family housing, which is a big chunk of zoning. This is where you see neighborhoods in North Seattle or outside of Bellevue, like Eastern Bellevue, or some other place where the zoning's been there for decades. It just says that in this area, we're going to build single-family homes. And the push from the central planners has been to eliminate a lot of that zoning, or at least make that zoning harder to have. And I don't like it because it takes away local control. I'm not a big fan of a lot of the approaches they take in zoning, but general zoning, fairly simple and easy to understand zoning, creates a level of predictability within a certain part of a community. And I think there's some value to that. When they when they decide that it's illegal for you to do that as a community, you don't even have that option, that's where I have a huge problem with how the states approach this. Washington's been pushing it. They haven't formally banned single family housing. What they're doing is they're providing cover for cities like Seattle or other cities into making it harder for them to have single family housing zone areas. And I don't think that's a good thing. I really think it's better when somebody can own a home for their life, for their investment in the future, for everything. It gives them an asset. I don't like the inflating the value of homes or artificially, right? That they're not worth what they're inflating them at, because I think that just inevitably creates a bubble that blows up later. But single family housing is a great approach to living. Apartment housing is hard. If you don't own your apartment, living in an apartment complex, and if anybody's ever doorbelled apartments, I have many times, and people move to an apartment complex, and I've never doorbelled anybody living in an apartment complex who said, I am living the dream right now where I'm at, and I don't want to go anywhere. All of them have plans that I've ever talked to about. I'm living in a place. I lived in cheap housing when I was up in Bellingham when I was first out of college. You aren't living in the place. It's my dream place. I'm living here, and I'd like to save enough money so I can buy a place, right? Or I'd like to I'd like to improve my situation in life. That's usually what happens. And if you make it so that people can't get out of that rental cycle, there's bitterness that's going to occur with people over time. And that's the policy that government seems to be pushing right now. And it's very hard. Rock is a question here saying zoning sucks. Do you agree? Sure, I do. But one of the things that happens is if you do have zoning and there's a predictability where somebody moves in and they buy a piece of property or a home, and they think that that's and it's zoned that way, and that's what they're doing. If you change the rules on them suddenly at the last minute, that's not fair to them and their investment. It's a problem, right? It causes issues for them. So I am generally against a lot of the zoning, but simple zoning, if they have to do that, that's fine. It's not as damaging. Charlene mentioned a question: why did Evil Inslee quit? Well, he just decided he's not going to run for a fourth term, probably because he has some kind of golden parachute job somewhere. I don't know what it is, but it'll be something. We'll find out in a little while. Rock question here: do you believe separation of church and state means that we can't promote Christian values? No, that's not true. It doesn't mean that at all. And there's a whole, I don't want to get into it here, but there's people who have written plenty of stuff about this that are more eloquent and thorough than I would be in a live stream right now. But anyway, and then you have this question here. And do you think the book of Revelation is unfolding? Yeah. So here's my story on that. By the way, this is an interesting question you bring up, because there's a lot of activists on the conservative freedom side of the equation who self-identify as Christians, right? And they read Revelations and they believe that we're living in end times right now. And I'm reminded, and therefore it's actually kind of an apocalyptic kind of approach to living. I think that people who view the world that way are oftentimes exceptionally ignorant about history, and it's somewhat useful to go back and study history and look at all the times, and there's dozens and dozens of them, where the people living at that time were convinced that they were living in the end times, apocalypse, Revelations unfolding in front of them at the time. I had a good friend of mine from Christian school when I was younger, and his grandmother, right before she died in her late 90s, she was telling him about when she was 16, she was convinced that she was living in end times. It was the end of the world. She was living in Revelations, and she was hoping that she could live long enough to see her 18th birthday. And here she is in her late 90s. And apparently end times was a little bit further down the road than she thought. And the way I think that relates to us today is if you went back and you looked at various times in history, in England in 1666, the Great Fire of London, right? They were convinced they were living in end times. You go back in the 1200s and the invasion of the Mongols coming from the east and burning the cities and just this rampage. They were convinced they were living in end times. You had some of the biggest volcanic activity in the world at the time, big earthquakes in the Mediterranean, right? They were convinced they were living in end times. I can point out so many times in history where people felt that way. Who knows? Maybe you are, maybe we are. But I think if you modify your life and you try to live it like that's the way it is, that it's a very self-defeating. It encourages you to not be involved in the political process and try to make a difference where you live. And so it's one of the reasons why I don't think that's a wise way to live your life. So that's just me. Nate's asking, why can't we get any good Republican conservative candidates in Washington? Well, I think you can, and I think we've had them at times. I don't think good political candidates just grow on trees and fall out of the sky. I actually think to some extent they're nurtured, and you find them among groups of people who get involved and who care about their community. And so you do get good ones that come up all the time, not all of them. And part of the reason is the motivation of what it takes for you to run for office. People run for political office for a lot of reasons. A good percentage of people tend to run for office for ego and self-gratification reasons, in the sense that for the same reason that people do stupid stunts on TikTok so they can get views, it's a way for them to build identity with the recognition that they get from others. And so that's not a great way to motivate somebody to be a politician, but it is a way, human nature being what it is, that's going to drive people there. Recognition. You get treated differently when you're elected to office. And so a lot of people kind of get addicted to that. And that's why they're running, whether they call themselves Republican or Democrat or whatever they call themselves. That's actually a real train of motivation that exists there. Sometimes there's also people get involved for truly, genuinely corrupt reasons. I don't think that's the majority. I think most people, though, will get involved, and they at least want to say that they get involved to do the right thing, whatever that is. And then once they get into office, I also think that you suddenly get inundated with a lot of different pressures and influences that I think you have to be a very strong person to stay true to whatever it is your belief system is, and not be led astray by this. And I think it's hard. It's hard to find people like that out there today. When you do find them, nurture them and support them, make them feel supported. Because remember, if you are a conservative, liberty, freedom-oriented Republican in office, you are going to be under constant attack. Very few people enjoy that. Some people do. I actually enjoy it, but that makes me a strange person. And I'm an activist, I've been in office before. I was a school board member for a number of years, but anyway, Moxie, you got a question about thoughts on Martin versus Boise? No, I don't right now. I would have to look that one up. To be honest with you, I'm confusing in that. That case is confusing to me right now because there's another Boise case I'm thinking about. So no, can't remember what that is right now. I could look it up and give you my thoughts, but I'm not going to do that right now. TZ, you're asking a question about the Kerry Lake court decision today. I don't know. I haven't read it, so I have no opinion on that. Well, that's funny. Somebody there asking, when are you running for a judgeship? I'm never running for a judgeship. And one of the things is you do have to be an attorney to run for a judgeship. And I don't have a law degree. So technically I wouldn't be able to do it. Question, Jason, question, what's your thoughts on the debt ceiling and will Republicans cave? The debt ceiling is an artificial construct that you're just trying to put some kind, in theory, we're trying to use it as a controlled way to keep them from blowing the budget up. And of course, the Democrats are panicking or creating a panic saying, America's going to, default on its debt. Unfortunately, the way they run the federal government, America's going to default on its debt at some point in time anyway. The only question is when. The debt ceiling argument, maybe that delays it a little bit longer, but I don't see anybody reducing the debt in the country. And the only way you're going to not default is if you can reduce it in some way. So you reduce it through inflation, you can reduce it in spending a lot less, and there hasn't been the backbone or desire apparently to do that. And that's a huge nightmare coming down the road. So whether the Republicans will cave or not, I don't know. They've surprised me with how strong they've been lately, in the last few weeks and sticking to their guns on this. So I'm relatively proud of them for doing that. But DC's a long ways away. It's 3,000 miles away. I don't know all the drama that they're dealing with. And there's 100 other people that are probably more knowledgeable than I am commenting on that issue. Let's see. I'm trying to find a question here. There's a question. What can be done? This is Jason again. Thank you. You're using the @WeTheGovernment, which makes it a lot easier for me to find that question. What can be done to prevent all these homeless people and mentally ill people from riding the bus? I honestly avoid riding because of that. Well, of course, everybody, especially, good Lord, in the Seattle area, but riding the bus is a nightmare now. When I was a kid, I remember when I lived in Federal Way, or just outside of Federal Way, we're kind of West Hill, Kent. I remember my mom letting me take the bus and go down to South Center, going up to SeaTac Mall. And on occasion, I remember going in with my friend, probably I was about 12, 13 years old, taking the bus all the way into Seattle. And, there's no cell phones back then. And it's not that you didn't have odd people sometimes get on the bus. That would happen. But it's nothing like what we see now. And so, the homeless industrial complex and that whole little architecture has been built around increasing drug addiction, in open drug addiction, and encouraging more drug addicts to come to Seattle. That has done more than anything else, I think, to destroy public transportation, or any of the theories around it in Washington than anything else. So it's kind of a disaster. And I don't blame you for not wanting to take the bus. I wouldn't either. And it's not the kind of thing that I would want to spend my time doing if I was in Seattle. With that, guys, I know we're kind of. I usually try to do these for about an hour. We're about an hour 10 minutes in. So I think that we'll start kind of trying to wrap it up. I know I said I was going to talk about being an activist, or what makes a conservative activist, a little bit. So let me just close with just a couple comments, if I can, about what it takes to be an activist, or what you would do as an activist. I don't think I try to train activists in Washington State. When I worked at the Freedom Foundation, I did that for a number of years. And since I've been on my own, since 2015, I've been doing that on my own as well, trying to train activists in their own way. I don't believe that you create this little shoebox and you try to squeeze somebody in and say, that's what you have to do to be an activist. I think that, especially conservative, freedom, liberty-oriented activists, you have a lot of options on what you can do. And if you want to be effective, you don't look at probably somebody like me and say, oh, I'm going to be exactly like Glenn, because you're just going to have a different passion, different focus. You don't have to be just like anybody else. You can find a passion and something that you can work on. I think that you do have to find something that you care about and focus on it. And that is going to logically lead down the road towards the things that make you more interested in being a activist. When I was younger, it was gun rights and the Second Amendment that really made me interested. I actually interned at the Second Amendment Foundation back in the early 90s when I was in college. Reading Hayek's Road to Serfdom and Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. I was a totally opposite guy, but these are the thing, right? Atlas Shrugged. When I read the Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged when I was younger, and I was really into history, and so I read a lot of stuff. That's in college. That really kind of shifted my conservative thinking in a lot of ways. So people who are conservative, liberty oriented tend to be influenced by what they read or what they believe. The Constitution, individual rights, the unique elements that exist here in our country, the effort by the founding fathers to create something so unique that it's so amazing, it's lasted as long as it is, and it's worth fighting for, and it's worth fixing, and it's worth protecting, because there is no other option. It isn't going to just somehow appear somewhere else in the world. Freedom's is an easy thing to sell, but it's a tremendous threat to those who want to do bad things to you and manipulate and use government as a personal piggy bank for their dreams and schemes. So conservative activists have to find ways, I think, of being effective in promoting liberty and freedom where they live. Local activism is going to be way more impactful in your life and your ability to influence what's happening than obsessing about what's going on in DC. I think pay attention to what's going on in DC, but you have very little influence over what happens 3,000 miles away. It might be different if you lived in Maryland or you're right across the river or something, but where we live, the things that affect our lives in Washington State are what happen in our communities. So if you have a police department near you that's being cut in half, that's going to affect your life way more than whatever happens in DC. If DC fell into a sinkhole tomorrow and disappeared after the celebrations are over, most people would be able to go about the day-to-day life here in Washington State. We'd hardly notice. However, if your police department went away tomorrow, you'd probably notice fairly quickly. And if the roads weren't repaired, you would notice pretty quickly. And if the bridges started to fall down, you'd notice quickly, right? There's logical local things. If your dams started to fall apart, you had no power, you would notice quickly. Those are the things that I think we have the ability to make an influence where we live significantly. Liberty and freedom-oriented conservative activists have tended to not pay attention to local government. When I was younger, and I was an activist in college, I had no interest in local government. Even though my dad was on the city council and helped found the city of Newcastle, I thought that was a small ball sort of activity. And now I appreciate more and more how important that kind of stuff really is. So I think that getting involved in your local community is one of the best things you can do. You can't be a solo operator. You have to work with other people. You have to have a personality type that work with other people. If you're a drama queen and you must have drama and personal drama in your life, you're going to be an ineffective activist, and you probably won't achieve whatever goals that you think you have. So I would say that focusing on trying to work together in small teams to focus your school board, your city council, getting rid of stupid fees and fines, getting rid of dumb taxes, downsizing government, identifying even how your local government functions. These are things you can do, and that's a great start if you want to become involved. I do a lot of speaking and training this week. I was in Union Club making a presentation, I think last Thursday. Saturday, I was the MC at the Pierce County Republicans. Then Sunday, I spoke out of the Bainbridge Island Women's Republican Club. And then Monday, I was speaking at North Seattle to a group in North Seattle, 32nd Ledge District Republicans. And hopefully, in doing so, I'm helping to inspire more people to be more active and effective in their activism as we move forward. But it's not an instant overnight thing. It's easy to get discouraged because people want, and it's kind of an American thing now, where we have this tendency to believe that if we're engaged and want to do something, we should be able to solve the world's problems in a 2-hour Sunday afternoon special. And all the world's problems can be solved, right? And therefore, we expect that we do something. And why doesn't the world change tomorrow? But that's really not how it works. It's a gradual process over time that you have the ability to influence. And sometimes you have leaps forward, not in the Chinese Maoist way, but, leaps forward in success. You do. It happens sometimes. But it only happens because you're engaged, because you're willing to show up, because you're willing to be out there fighting the good fight, finding other allies, recruiting more people, being more engaged. Don't be crazy, trying to do things that are fun and interesting. Nobody likes a bitter critter. If you're perpetually bitter and planning for the apocalypse tomorrow, you're not going to be effective probably at growing your group. So I think there's a lot of ways that you can make an impact as an activist. And culturally, I just don't think the conservative liberty, freedom sort of side of things has been focused that way. So I'm hoping to inspire more people. We're really in a good state for that. We have the opportunity to do a lot. I love Washington. I'm 5th generation here, as many of you know. And I want to fix Washington. This is my home, and it's where my kids live, and it's where a lot of my family lives. I want to make Washington a better place. And to do that, we're going to have to deal with some crazy people. And we need to get them out of office, and we need to downsize and dismantle the centralized state that they've kind of built up around them like an edifice. With that, we just need people like you and others who are willing to get out there and engage. Thank you guys so much. I didn't pay attention actually to how many people were on here at any given time, but it's coming to an end. I got a long drive ahead of me tonight, but I just want to thank everybody for being here. Thank you so much for supporting We the Governed. I'm assuming most of you already subscribed to this video channel if you've been on this long. And feel free to go to my website and sign up there. When I write articles or I post stuff there, you'll get that automatically sent to you. I think I do a fundraising email once a year, twice a year through that website as well. So with that, guys, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the evening. It's a good day out there, and we'll see you next week.